This show is supported by viewers like you. Donate now to receive special early access.
Once upon a time, in the mysterious land of Portland, Oregon, an aging hipster was critiquing the work of a
Much more successful.
aging hipster. Hey!
I'm not that old.
We're here to talk about Scott Pilgrim! 1, 2, 3, 4!
Scott Pilgrim is a property that was probably always destined for cult status, but fortunately that cult has grown substantially over the last decade and change. The 2010 film is one of my all-time favorite comedies, but I'm also not surprised that it originally flopped in theaters. It's such a unique premise that it's almost completely unmarketable. You have this weird intersection of anime, retro gaming, and indie rock all wrapped up in the trappings of a romantic comedy. But even though that is a very specific audience, that audience eventually caught up, to the point where a revival suddenly didn't seem so far-fetched. So, in 2019, the prospect of a new series was pitched to creator Brian O'Malley, with Japanese studio Science Saru providing the animation. And, if you'll excuse the phrase, it really felt like getting the band back together. The entire cast of the film returned to reprise their roles, director Edgar Wright came back on to serve as executive producer, and even Anna Monoguchi returned to provide the soundtrack after originally providing music for the video game. Personally, I was really excited when this series was announced because I always thought the original story could use more expansion. As much as I love Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, I freely admit that the story suffered a bit when adapting it to film. And not just because they were crunching 6 manga volumes to fit into a 2-hour runtime, but because only half of those 6 volumes were released when the film originally started production. You'll notice there's a lot of detail for the first 3 battles, and then they just kinda yada yada the other 3 battles. While both the books and the movie fundamentally have the same events happen, the context and setup for those events are very different, and a lot of the character development gets lost. Bear in mind, this doesn't mean the movie is bad by any stretch. It just ends up being a different experience. The way I've always described it to others is that the film has more comedy while the manga has more heart. There's nothing wrong with that, it just means that they're satisfying for different reasons. Edgar Wright was at the top of his game when he made this film, and his relentless style of comedy was a perfect fit. I'm among the fortunate few who saw this during its original theatrical run, and I can pinpoint the exact moment where I absolutely lost it. It was right here when the vegan police are leaving. Still gets me. So, like many of you I'm sure, that was my train of thought. I thought this was going to be the full version of the original story. But things didn't really turn out that way. Now, before we dive in deep, I'm going to try to sum up Scott Pilgrim as quickly as I can for those of you who are unfamiliar with it. Scott Pilgrim is an idiotic 20-something from Toronto with no job who shares a bed with his gay roommate, Wallace Wells. He also plays bass in his terrible band with an awesome name, Sex Bomb, with his friend Steven Stills on guitar and his ex-girlfriend Kim Pine on drums. Scott is still reeling from his breakup with his far more successful ex, Envy Adams, so he's on the rebound with 17-year-old Knives Chow, a detail that the internet loves to act scandalized over, even though it's literally the first line in the story, and every single character in the story calls Scott out on how gross, sad, and inappropriate it is.
17 years old, scandal.
Even I would think twice about dating a 17-year-old.
Are you coming to my party Friday, or will you be busy babysitting?
But soon, Scott meets the girl of his dreams. Or rather, a girl in his dreams. Ramona Flowers, who's been using the inside of his brain as kind of a warp zone for her job as a delivery person. Presumably because there's so much vast empty space for her to use. In spite of Scott's obvious shortcomings, they hit it off. But then Scott is accosted by Ramona's exes. Specifically, the League of Evil Exes. Because the Association of Evil Exes would just be silly. And if Scott wants to keep dating her, he has to defeat all 7 in Mortal Kombat. You know, when most people get a new partner, they just get tested for VD. They don't have high-concept kung fu fights to the death. These evil exes include Bollywood nightmare Matthew Patel, skater-turned-actor Lucas Lee, vegan Tetsuo Todd Ingram, bi-furious ninja Roxy Richter, the Double Dragon douchebags Ken and Kyle Yanagi, and criminal mastermind Gideon Graves. As far as the animation goes, Science Saru has a strong rep for providing a hand-drawn look while using digital technology. O'Malley didn't have a hand in providing the new character models, but there's still very faithful updates of his original designs. Scott Pilgrim has always taken heavy cues from anime, and this is anime in the purest sense of the word. In fact, I highly recommend checking out the Japanese audio, because they got a high-quality cast for that too. My favorite is Aoi Koga's performance as Knives.
今夜セックスボボームのライブが見られると思うと興奮しすぎて気絶しちゃうかもです。
じゃあまだ衝撃のニュースは耳に入ってないな。
衝撃?
The first episode also faithfully recreates the story of the first volume and the first act of the film. Certain scenes are even redone line for line.
Why are you just standing there?
Dude, I'm totally waiting on you.
Gideon, your boyfriend?
He's a friend.
My last job was a long story filled with sighs.
But in spite of this, some things feel off. The captions that the series so frequently uses don't feel like introductions, they feel like reminders. As if we've already seen this story and they're just making sure we still know who everyone is. And little things are different too, like the fact that Crash and the boys don't show up for the band's gig at the end of the episode.
The opening band pulled out. They flaked.
Crash and the boys flaked?
Aww, but they were about to play my favorite song.
It's called We Hate You, Please Die.
Sweet. Love this one.
But whatever. Matthew Patel shows up at the end of the episode so he and Scott can have their fight same as before. And then this happens. Yeah. Matthew Patel wins the fight. Afterwards, Ramona tells him to fuck off because, seriously, what did he expect to happen? And then Matthew goes back to the evil exes and is like, yeah, what did we expect to happen? So he challenges Gideon to a fight, wins that one too, and gains control over his entire company. You can do that? Hold on, I'll be right back. I'm gonna go challenge Mark Zuckerberg to a fight. Meanwhile, back in Toronto, they hold a funeral for Scott, during which Envy puts on a show just to murder him all over again when he's already dead, and possibly take Steven Stills along with him.
She's the lead singer of my favorite band of all time.
I thought we were your favorite band.
They're my favorite real band. Sex Bob-omb's my favorite band that isn't real.
And then, when Ramona gets home that night, she's the one who has a dream about Scott, realizing he's still alive. After that, the series becomes a mystery as to who kidnapped Scott, and more importantly, why. Hi, excuse me, have you seen a young man with hair like this? So, needless to say, this was not at all what I expected. This is essentially an all-new story, but it turns out the fact that this is an all-new story is why O'Malley agreed to do it in the first place. He wasn't interested in retelling the books or the movie all over again, so the series became this instead. And the funny part is, I like it. In fact, I really like it. Think about it for a second. This is a rich cast of characters played by actors that have all gone on to bigger and better things since the movie first came out. And they all took time out of their busy schedules to return to their roles. It'd be a shame to just have them do the same thing all over again. This time, we get to see who they are when Scott isn't around, and see their roles in the story change completely. Some people have referred to Scott Pilgrim Takes Off as a reimagining of the original story, but I like to think of it as a response. I said this show was anime in the truest sense of the word, and I meant it. In fact, it reminds me of two anime in particular, the rebuild of Evangelion and the disappearance of Haruhi Suzumiya. Evangelion's story was always heavily influenced by Hideki Anno's struggle with depression and his personal disdain for otaku culture. So by the time End of Evangelion rolled around, he was ready to torch the franchise and run. The rebuild movies were meant to just be short retellings of the original series, but Anno's improved mental health inspired him to take things in a very different direction from the third movie onwards. And like fucking everything involving Evangelion, it got a mixed response. But I'll say this, at least now there seems to be a light at the end of that very, very dark tunnel. Meanwhile, the world of Haruhi Suzumiya is literally built around Haruhi Suzumiya. She's the center of this universe, even if she can't know that, lest she blow everything up by accident. But the Disappearance movie dares to ask who these characters are without her, and the fantastical elements that she brings with her. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is the same way, and even if it's a new story, it still gives me something that wasn't in the film version, which is more character development for Ramona. In the manga, Ramona's character arc kinda runs in parallel to Scott's. Remember, it's her evil exes that he is fighting. During the final battle with Gideon, she realizes this is her fight as much as it is his, and they team up to defeat Gideon together. In the movie, she just kinda became a damsel in distress to streamline the story more. But here, she's arguably the main character. The evil exes all serve as suspects in her search for Scott, and as she whittles down her list, it gives her the opportunity to resolve things and get closure all on her own. And before you think this gets too serious, don't worry. This is still Scott Pilgrim, which means even if we get more substantial character development, the proceedings around it are still thoroughly silly. For example, Roxy Richter is the first evil ex that Ramona resolves things with. But before that, they have a big epic fight inside Kim's video store and get knocked into different movies, with Kim herself even abusing the pause feature to help Ramona out. Only noobs use the pause glitch. Also, they start producing a movie based off of Scott's life, with Todd and Envy playing Scott and Ramona respectively, which is just so hilariously weird.
Ramona.
We need to talk about Scott Pilgrim.
I'm Scott Pilgrim.
It's easy to joke that the best version of Scott Pilgrim doesn't have Scott Pilgrim in it, but I disagree. Scott's absence kinda reveals that he's no better or worse than the people around him. Scott Pilgrim is not a good person. But he's not a bad person either. He's not malicious, conniving, vindictive, or manipulative. Frankly, he's not smart enough to be any of those things. At his worst, Scott is immature, avoids confrontation, and doesn't always consider the feelings of others. Yeah, he sucks, but removing him from the narrative shows that his friends and enemies suck just as much as he does. I think part of the reason Scott is such a divisive character is because we see ourselves in him, even if we don't like to admit that. If I may quote Helsing Ultimate Abridged,
"Nobody isn't kind of an asshole in their early 20s, and if they actually weren't, they were probably sociopaths."
In my 20s, I did plenty of things that were immature and insensitive. Hell, I'm in my 30s and I still make mistakes like that all the time, even if I don't mean to. I'm not saying it's right, I'm saying life is messy and shit happens. When I say Scott and his friends suck, I'm not saying that judgmentally. I'm saying it as a fact. The sun rises in the east, fire is hot, and people do shitty things they regret when they're young. I also like that they acknowledge Scott's divisive nature without falling into self-flagellation. And yes, just for the people in the back, they make it clear that they know that a 20-something dating a 17-year-old is not okay.
I probably shouldn't have been dating you in the first place. Apparently a 23-year-old dating a high schooler is frowned upon by society.
So okay, I know I've spoiled a fair amount of Scott Pilgrim Takes Off at this point, but if you'll forgive me, I'd prefer not to spoil the ending. I will say this though, the ending asks a very important question that I'm sure fans themselves have asked. Whether or not Scott and Ramona would actually stay together. As thoroughly silly as it is, part of the reason I like Scott Pilgrim is that it becomes kind of a litmus test for your past experiences when it comes to romance. Your enjoyment of it is going to be colored by how your past relationships worked out, for good and for ill. Scott and Ramona had a lot of drama they needed to work through, but to me, whether they stayed together in the end wasn't the point. The point was they both resolved to confront their past mistakes and look forward to a brighter future, which they can hopefully achieve regardless whether they stay together or not. Maybe things don't work out the way you hoped, but that doesn't mean you can't grow in new, unexpected ways. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off wasn't what I was expecting, but in the best possible way. It's far from a retelling of the original story, but it's not quite a sequel either. It's almost like a companion piece, a remix, if you will. My only real criticism is that your enjoyment of it may be dependent on your previous familiarity with the franchise, but that familiarity constitutes 6 manga volumes, 1 movie, and 1 video game if you're feeling sassy. If you're really interested in knowing more, it doesn't take long to get caught up. Some viewers are angry at the new direction, saying that the trailers tricked them. And maybe they did, but I think they tricked us in the best possible way. I was fully expecting just a retelling of the manga, but I admit when I was watching the first episode, I got kind of bored. I thought, I've seen this already. And friends of mine who hadn't watched it yet asked if it was just a 1-to-1 copy. I was delighted to tell them that it wasn't. It's one of the great surprises of the year, and I highly recommend it. After all, what's the point of writing a song if you can't play it in a whole new key? Thanks for watching!